have you join me in welcoming Gustavo Plascencia, talking about intersections and explorations of landscapes, history, and the body.
All right, so first of all, I'm going to lower the lights just enough so we can look at the pretty pictures. Thank you. All of you, except for Kalisha, who was here late, got something today. So, because I know that today I had a lot of competition, I felt like you needed to get something from me today. I know there's a lot of other talks, and there's a little tiny print, but also inside of it, it's a little poem from Spanish author, somebody that I look up to, and it's in English and Spanish, so you can read whichever you prefer. That really talks about the landscape, and the landscape as a way of a body. And it's just a little section of it, and I think that if you read it through, you will get a sense of where I'm coming from. Before I start today, an imposition. Today, I want to dedicate this lecture to my grandmother who passed away recently, and I was unable to go to the funeral, but I was able to see her over the summer, so that was not too bad. But she lived a full life. She got to be 92, so it was time for me to go. But at the same time, she was the only grandparent really that I really knew, and my only connection to a previous generation. And as you can see you will see throughout the lecture, you'll see that that's very important for me. So just bear with me. Before I start, I'm a photographer, and photography actually just celebrated the 175th anniversary. August 19, 1839 was when it was announced to the world, we have this new thing. Now, very early on, people didn't know what to do with it. And this is a quote from the Art Journal from 1860, which states basically that photography must be true because it's real, right? We photograph in reality. So there's no way that we can deceive you. There's no way that you can be fooled into thinking something else. Well, this is a secret that we photographers like to do, but really, we lie all the time. Even by choosing what to photograph and not photograph, what to include versus not to include in the frame, we are somehow manipulating reality. So all throughout my lecture, I want you to keep that in mind because I do that all the time. And what you see is not necessarily what I want you to see, or is not necessarily quote unquote real or truth. I play a lot. Even when you think about documentation, something that it must be real. This is one of the images from the Mexican-American War back in 1847, not even 10 years into the medium. Now, first of all, there's two things that are important with this image. One is, it is a setup. At the time, the technology was not there to take just a snapshot. People went with the horses, ran in the middle of the street, and sat there or stand there for anything between 1 to 5 minutes. Okay, so this is not a snapshot, it's not real documentation, it's more a commemoration. And whenever we look at documentation of photography the very early on, periods of that, we always question how much of it is true and how much it is not true. So that is one thing that has to do with the medium and my work, but the other thing is that the Mexican-American War is something that I learned as a 22-year-old man coming to America. In Mexico, we have a battle, and then Santa Anna, which was the president at the time, sold the territory. There was never, ever, in the history books, a quote-unquote war. We had a different perception of that conflict. So the Mexican-American War is told differently in the States than the way it is told in Mexico. And that's something that I play with, the perceptions and who's doing the telling, who is telling this quote-unquote reality or this truth. So all through undergrad, I mostly did, and also actually grad school, I mostly did kind of studio environment portraiture. And it wasn't until I started traveling myself that I found myself in foreign countries, in different places, that I have very little in common or very little knowledge about. And I wanted to document, of sorts, what I was going through, but also I've asked myself, like, why would I take a picture that I've seen before, first of all? Many much better photographers than me have come to these places and photographed them properly. So how can I make this new landscape, this new environment my own? So I started thinking about the fact that since I went away for college when I was 17, growing up in Mexico, I moved about 8 times as an adult. And every time I move, because of job or because of school, I have to get acclimated or get familiarized with a new environment. So the idea of home with capital H doesn't really exist for me. Every time I move to a new place, that's my home for X amount of years. Every time I go back to my parents, it's not really my home or where I grew up, because my parents immigrated when I was 18 to the States. So when I go visit my parents, I don't go to the house I grew up in. So that idea of home, I always say that is wherever I'm going next. You know, if I'm with my parents, like, oh, it's time to go home. That means Alamosa now. If I'm here, if I'm going for a break, I'm going home to go see them, you know, or my parents, my brothers or sisters, or there are certain people that I collected, if you will, that are now family, that they're really not blood related, but whenever I go see Casey, for instance, she's home for me. So this project I did when I was traveling. Some of the images are from all over the place, and this particular project has this idea of a Spanglish, this disconnection, and that's something that you will see throughout this lecture today. Some of the things are going to be in English, some of the things are going to be in Spanish, because my brain works differently, and I'll talk about language and how I relate to it in a bit. But I'm very truthful to the work, and if the idea comes in Spanish, I'll carry through in Spanish. If the idea comes in English, I carry through in English. And that for me is very important, to be true to the work. So this project is basically each of the images is a Spanglish sentence that is not necessarily grammatically correct in either one of the 2 languages, but somehow it makes sense. It just rolls out of my tongue, right? And it's actually each image is an answer to the question that the series calls, O God, Dulce God, where are you? And for me, it's all those places that I visited, all the places that are meaningful to me, places that I have experiences and I remember, okay? So I created these images that are collages. They're black and white, silver gelatin prints, and they're actually physical collages. Now, if you see over here is tiny little dots, they're actually pinned into the mat board. They're not digital prints, they're not one single print. In this case, there's 2 different prints that you can actually see them overlapping. So they're not connected, but somehow they overlap. And that's something that you will see throughout my work. This series I did when I was traveling with a group of students in Central America. And again, when I travel, I'm very interested in exploring the environment. I know some of the history. We share a lot of history with the Mayan culture, southern part of Mexico. I was in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Belize. And I started taking pictures of details, big details of big pyramids, of structures, kind of more contemporary structure, landscape, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it. I came back to the States, I was living in Pennsylvania at the time, and I just spent hours and hours in the darkroom printing these small prints. And then I started looking at them and realizing that they were very abstract in nature. So I started putting them together to combine different images together. I'm very interested in the physical layers. As you can see, first of all, I do all of the woodwork that you will see throughout the lecture. It's very simple. I'm not a woodworker by any means, but I like the idea of building things. I like the idea of having the object versus just an image. For me, the object carries much more history, personal history, than just an image. An image, it's up on the wall and you don't interact with it. But if it's an object, even if all of you don't get to do it, to actually handle it, you perceive it differently than if it's just a flat image. I often refer to this idea of how, I remember growing up with furniture that my parents had. But I don't have any furniture that my grandparents had. I don't have any furniture that my parents had, And I certainly don't have any furniture right now that I could pass on to my family or to my children. Is this idea of things that are mementos, this idea that are relics, and that we don't really have that anymore. And I'm very fascinated by that. So, because I'm building objects now with images, I'm very careful about treating all of the surfaces. Not only the images is the one thing that is important, that's where I start, but all of the surfaces all around. In this case, you'll see very dark, but it has a side of dark kind of purple cloth. This one is my palm print with sand that I brought from my hometown in Acuña in Mexico. So I like to make these kind of connections, that the places that I'm photographing and the objects and elements, the raw materials that I'm using, they come from different places, but somehow, through me, they're all together in this environment. The other thing that I do often is this reference to native ways. The feathers is something that is very symbolic to me, that you'll see over and over. And Jenny actually collects feathers for me for her chickens that eventually make it into the artwork. These feathers were bought from other places, but now again, like the feather is so important for me, but now Jenny is connected to the artwork. Even if you don't know her, even if you don't, if I move somewhere else, the connection, the personal connection is there. And that for me is very important, this idea of community, this idea of everything influencing what I do. The other one that I have here, for instance, this is an image that it was shot in Central America. The bark that you see on top of it was from my residency that I did about 3 years ago in Italy. So the bark I brought back from Italy. And this is a mariachi bow tie that I bought when I traveled to Mexico, to Guadalajara, which is, he's originally from Jalisco, so kind of mid-Pacific. So I did a road trip with him about 6 years ago. And it is this idea of connecting places, this idea of connecting cultures, this idea of connecting lives, if you will. So for me, even though you no longer see most of the landscape, if you think of a landscape, you think of trees and horizon line and mountains, it is still a landscape for me. It is sections of it. And for me, it's that very, very interesting. The other thing that you'll notice is the titles are kind of ambiguous. I want to give a hint of where I want to take you, but I don't want to tell you what to think. I don't want to tell you what this is about. For instance, this Molethon, you can relate it to my own experience, but also to the experience of the people who live in these environments. You know, the Mayas in this case, these are images that I took in Guatemala. And again, you'll see elements, and I talk about in my class this kind of style, things that kind of recur themselves, that go back over and over again. The feathers is something that will come back to me. The other thing that you'll see is things that are hidden, or things that are not perfectly clear. And that kind of speaks of this kind of cultural element that is the secrets. You know, there's a lot of taboos, and we don't talk about things, and everybody knows about it, but you know, it's something that you don't talk about it. So some of the work will show that. In this case, this little section has been uncovered. So the darker area was actually covering the lighter area. So whenever you actually see this piece, you can see what's underneath, and it's kind of hidden, unburied, things that are hidden away, put away because we don't want to talk about it. When I made this print, or this image, I was thinking about the conflict that Central America had in the past. And then after that, the conflict moved to Mexico. And this is an image that you will see often in newspapers in Mexico in the last 2 or 3 years. And for me, it was very interesting because when I made the print, I was referencing something else, and then things changed, and it was referencing a new thing. And it was similar, it was a different location. And for me, that kind of cyclical kind of ideas are very, very interesting. When I traveled to Italy, I was there for about 3.5 months, doing a couple of residencies and taking Italian lessons. And I was photographing with this Holga camera, which is a plastic camera. Meaning, technically speaking, 2 things. One is it allows me to overlap the images, like this one. So this is a full sections of a film. They're not done digitally. And two, it gives you this very kind of dreamlike quality because the lens is made out of plastic, so nothing is going to be really, really sharp. Okay? So because of the overlapping of the images, which is most of the images that you got today, it was shot the same way. It gives you these very, very interesting connections where things overlap, they kind of obscure and weird, if you will. And the title of this series, it kind of plain words, both in English and Spanish. The landscape and paisaje is literally the same thing in English and Spanish. But the name of the series is Escapes and Pasajes. Escapes is this, I imagine these images as to be this kind of daydreaming, these things that you wish you could go to and you can see. But also they're passages, they're almost rite of passage. They're things that you can imagine and they take you somewhere else. And the word passage or pasaje in Spanish, it has this kind of religious connotation. In pasaje as in chapter and verse, pasaje en capítulo y versículo. And for me, that connection to religion is very important. I am by no means a practicing Catholic, but the way I see it is I'm a cultural Catholic because just because I don't live in Mexico and because I don't speak Spanish every day, I'm still Mexican. I will never ever not be Mexican. And for me, religion is the same way. Just because I go to church every Sunday doesn't mean that I'm no longer Catholic. It is ingrained in me and the way I see things. Now, that doesn't mean that the thing I want to make sure is I don't like to misrepresent myself, but a lot of the work, a lot of the religious iconography, as you will see in a minute, it comes to the work, and it is more kind of cultural Catholicism. For me, it was a shock to come here and see how Catholicism was a much more strict way of Catholicism. In Mexico, it's much more relaxed. For me, it's very, very different. When I travel to Central South America, or even to Italy, I still go to church because I like the rituals, I like the tradition, but here it feels very stiff. It feels very different for me. And I don't need to speak ill of anybody if I have Catholics in the room, but it's a different kind of expression. So this series, again, it is all kept in Italian. And for me, it was very interesting to think of this prehistory, things that had happened in this environment and with different people, that I could relate to it, that I know of, especially in iconic places like Rome. I know the history of Rome. I know the people who live there. I know certain things that makes this place even much more interesting to me. And somehow I am connected to that environment through this image. And that's something I kind of think about whenever I walk into a new building and whenever I walk to, even here in the valley, like the history that the valley has. And you'll see some of those images coming up. But I like this idea of connections. Nothing is new. The ground that I'm walking has been walked on for many, many years. And somehow I feel connected to those people. Even if I never actually personally knew them, even if their lives are completely different than mine, there's this connection. So moving from foreign places and trying to make the images my own, I came to this idea of witnessing histories. The idea of the landscape as a witness. The landscape has been here for many, many years, or there, whichever place you want to think about, and have witnessed its histories, personal and important and little and mundane and non-important, but they're still histories. So I like to think of the landscape as this person, as this entity has witnessed something. And in this case, it's not necessarily about the physical place. This one location perhaps not being where the bargains were crossing, but is the idea of it, is what represents. So I also often go from these macro ideas to the micro. And also myself, in this case, it is a witness of my history. It is a witness of something that is important to me. And when I'm there and I have a realization, when I'm photographing, I try to keep that true. So I go between this kind of idea of society or civilization kind of history to my own personal history. And it's something that I kind of go back and forth because it's not only about the big questions, but the little questions. My life is still important to me. Maybe not to everybody, maybe not to make it to the history books, but it is important, it's what I'm going through, and I feel like I need to represent that in the artwork. So I'm gonna go back and forth between those two big questions. The other thing that I'm fascinated through language is the idea of things changing names, just because you cross a border. So the river here, Rio Grande, it's called Rio Bravo in Mexico. It's the same exact river, starting from one country going to another one, but as soon as you cross the border, it has a different name. And that for me is very interesting because of what the connotation of both words mean. Grande just big means big. And it's really not that big here in Alamosa, but it's big, right? Bravo, on the other hand, is dangerous. It's not brave, it's not a literal translation. Bravo is a dangerous river, which in Mexico, again, people trying to cross the river, it's a dangerous path. People crossing the river perish sometimes. And the connotation of the same river has a different meaning just by crossing the border. And that for me is fascinating, how language affects how we think about things. This is another one that has to do with me, and it kind of going back and forth between the two, this big history with little, lowercase history, that it is important to me. I often refer to people who know how to write much better than I do. I read a lot. Most of my influences come from the written word more than the visual world, because I feel like it speaks to me much better. It has this meaning to me. It has to send time. And I really like this quote about, and I would say an artist, but he said, a writer needs three things: experience, observation, and imagination. And at any which point, you can have one or the other, but you can miss one of the three, but not two of the three. Okay? So the work that you're gonna see next, it's about that, the idea of previous knowledge. Not necessarily my own, not necessarily the experiences that I have had, but things that inspire me, either through friends or through written words, or poetry, or movies, or everything. Everything that I can encounter is something that could potentially inspire me. One of the reasons, very selfish reason, that I refuse to drop the O in front of my name is because I bear the same name of this very, very famous photographer from 1857. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is both my older brother and my sister have the family names. My parents had they had me, and they had this opportunity. Like with the other two kids, they have to have the names that their family names, Rosaelba, Jose Leopoldo. But with me, it was the first time they were creative, so they come out with Oscar and Gustavo. I cannot deny them that. So there's this kind of idea of pride, if you will. And I know it was just luck because I was the third, but still, like I was the first name that they came up with. The other two, they had to, because that's a tradition. So, kind of going back to talk about the medium and how it has changed, is this idea of, well, Photoshop ruined everything. Photoshop lies all the time. Photoshop is not good for the medium. Well, this image, 1857, is made out of 32 different negatives. It's a seamless print. Again, we've been lying all along. The idea of photography as a true medium it's a fallacy. And not only that, but we often look at other artworks for references. In this case, Reiklander based his image on Raphael's School of Athens. Okay? So not only are we lying to you, but we're borrowing ideas from other people. We're stealing ideas from other people. And that's the nature of the medium. So in the academic world, when there's this uproar about, well, Photoshop is changing the medium, well, every 30, 40 years, something has happened. When you have piece of glass as negatives, and then you have film, and then you have roll of film, and then you have the ability to produce multiples, not only one single image, and then you have color, and then you have tiny little cameras that you can carry with you, not all those big cameras that you have to hide underneath. This is something that is normal and common for the medium. The idea of Photoshop is just another development in the academic world. So this leads me to the self-portrait. And the one thing that I was telling, I think I talked Jenny and also Christy about it, is just, I usually do this talk somewhere else, and I bury myself and then walk away. And then I don't have to see them, right? But this is somehow I'm very, very stressed about this because I'm going to talk about a lot of things that you perhaps don't want to know, but it's about my work. Another thing that, thinking about language and culture and how or what we do when we sneeze, something's very, very simple. When somebody sneezes in English, you will say, bless you. In Spanish, my father's generation will say, Dios te bendiga. My generation, we don't say that. We say salud. And it's kind of a way of moving away from the religious connotation. Again, even if we're not practicing Catholic or Christians, by saying bless you, there's this connotation, this reinforcement of religion, even if we ourselves don't go to church. So, which means literally to your health. Which actually kind of goes back to the medieval times when people thought that by sneezing you will take it away or disposing of germs. So in theory, you will be healthier after you sneeze. Now, that's obviously not true, but that's where the belief comes from. Now, I do like this French way, à tes souhaits, that is to your wishes, whatever you might want. I really like that, but people already think I'm a snob, so if I start saying à tes souhaits in French, people will really not like it. Which is also kind of a leeway to culture and how even after 16 years in the States, I cannot bring myself to introduce myself in a social setting. You are, in Mexico, supposed to wait to be introduced. You don't ever introduce yourself. So, and I know that this is very kind of old country of me, but still, it's ingrained in myself. I don't do it. And some of you students, especially, if I don't know you, I might say hello, but I keep walking. I don't have this American way of introducing or doing things. Although I know in my head that's what I should do because I'm in this environment, I cannot bring myself to do it. So going back, just kind of a little bit of history. This is my undergraduate work. I was working in this Intouchable Realities where I was talking about, I often refer to this series as the Mestizo Series, talking about the acculturation that happened soon after the Spaniards got into Mexico. Either by choice or by force, this is what happened. I'm not really interested in the politics of how it happened, but in the result. This idea of this brand new race, the idea of a different culture that is very much blended. Even today, a lot of rituals in Catholic Church come from the native rituals because they were not able to completely eradicate it. And at some point, the culture is like, okay, well, we're going to start doing it your way because that's the only way it's going to happen. Okay? So even that tiny little section of difference between Catholicism in Mexico and Catholicism here is a huge difference for me. This is graduate work. As you can see, portraiture, controlled environments in a studio. I'm doing all the woodwork as well as all the customing. At this point, all of the pieces that you will see, all the customs that you'll see in these pieces are things that I made myself. I'm still very kind of control freak. So I was like, I cannot give this up. I need to do it myself. But also, I'm a process artist. It's something that I really require that time for me to fully comprehend what it is that I'm doing, fully develop an idea. So I think that it was a way for me to control the time. Because if I was doing something, then I would be thinking about it. The other thing that, if you think of sewing, this is very mundane, kind of numbing activity, moving, very rhythmic thing. And that allows me to be in my head. I don't have to pay too much attention to what actually I'm doing with my hands. And that is something that's very, very interesting to me. All through undergrad and grad school, my professors kept saying, your work is self-portraits. Even if your likeness is not in the image, it's all about you. You have to do self-portraits. I was not ready to do self-portraits. It took me about 8 years to really have the courage to do it. And this is the very first piece where you see part of myself. Now, if you notice, it's this tiny little piece of the picture. The whole thing is somebody else. I was trying to still use it. It was like, okay, I'll just try it and see how it feels. So this is the only section of the image that is myself. It is a self-portrait. Then everything else is somebody else. So 95% of the image, borrowed imagery, if you think. Their bodies, and I know it sounds very bad, but they're props for me. I need a female body, I need a male body, and my friends were around, and I use them, okay? So it is not about this specific person or that specific person. It's about the idea. In this case, the burden of history. I often think about if we were the first generation, if we have no precedent, if we can do whatever we wanted, it will be so much easier because we don't have to live up to anybody's expectations. We don't have to live up to anybody's ideas of what we're supposed to want and how we're supposed to act and what we're supposed to do at any given point. Even though at this point I'm kind of moving away from all the religious iconography, I still have this idea of religion. So you have a triptych. There's 3 sections. There are things that are going to come back, even if they're not crosses or Jesus and Mary's. There are things that are very symbolic to me. This idea of this center, and I know Michael is waiting for this section. This red river, it's kind of like the purgatory. It's kind of the section between heavens and earth. I'm kind of referencing the student Leonardo da Vinci, the idea of perfectly fitting in a square and a circle, where the circle represents heavens and the square represents earth. So even though you don't see the whole thing, I'm referencing this Vesuvian man. And for me, this is about tradition. This is about making choices. This is about trying to break away from the mold and being afraid of it. You will see a lot of this kind of conflict and struggle. When we think about who we are a collection of moments and experiences that sometimes are conflicting, and I think that that's what makes it much more interesting. If it was just black or white, it would be easier, but we don't live single issues life. We are multiple people. We have different ideas, and some of them are conflicted, and we have individually to reconcile those 2 or 3 sides of it. And then sometimes you kind of lean to one side more than the other, and it's a constant struggle. And this is something that you will see through my work. The other thing that I like is this idea of layering. I'm very bad. My professor in grad school would be appalled to see what it is that I'm doing because I'm mistreating the print. The print is supposed to be precious. You're not supposed to do anything to it. You're supposed to put it behind glass. But there's no glass. I'm actually going into it, and in this case, I'm doing a monoprint, which is a print-making process on top of the silver gelatin. I often sew them, I often rip them up, I burn them. I do everything that you can think about because I really like the idea of the history, of the idea of decay, of the idea not everything is going to be perfect forever because nothing is. Even if it's perfect right now, just give it 5 or 10 years and then things change, okay? So I really want to represent that in the artwork. This is another one that I really think is very interesting for me because it's the idea of redemption and damnation. And it's kind of like a symbolic way of representing them. Because they look very close. The good thing and the bad thing looks really, really close. Sometimes you do the wrong thing thinking it was the right thing, and vice versa. If you look at the image, it looks like almost a mirror image, but it's not quite. First of all, I have a different process here. There's no highlights, there's no white. It's a solarization process that happens, those of you who are taking photo of one, in the darkening. You, again, mistreat the print and mess with the process. And the other thing is, the figure, in this case, is not really the same. There are actually 2 different negatives. There are 2 different images. They're so close that you might think that it's the same, but it's really not. Alas de segunda mano is the second-hand wins, the idea of second chances, the idea of trying once more. And I shot this, and some of you know the story, but I shot this in Mexico. I was living in Pennsylvania, I drove to Texas, and then I kept going on my own, and I was basically camping out of my own house. My parents still have 2 houses in Mexico, but they're empty, nobody lives there. But for me, it was very important to be there and photograph in that environment. So I was basically living in an empty house. And my aunts and my uncles were very, very concerned about me. It's like, just stay with us, you have no, well, I had electricity and water, but there's basically nothing else. I had an inflatable mattress, I took tripods, and I took everything that I thought I would need. Except one thing, I forgot the cable release. Because I'm photographing with a big camera, view camera, by myself. So I need a cable that I will be able to press here that the camera's in front of me. So what I ended up doing, I went to the merceria to get thread. So this little line that you barely see here, I'm holding and I'm pulling back. So it's basically a string. I'm photographing with a string in Mexico. And you have to make do. I was not going to go back all the way to Pennsylvania to pick up my cable release. I was there by myself, camping out of my own house, making very, very worried. My family was very, very worried about it. So like, okay, I'm here, I have to do it. And sometimes you do it. There's nothing else you do. The next piece requires this little poem by Lope de Vega that I have in English up there, so you can follow, but I'm going to read it in Spanish. And just, it's very important for me, and I'm putting you through all of these things, but to better understand, to fully understand the work, this makes more sense. Desmayarse, atreverse, estar furioso, áspero, tierno, liberal, esquivo, alentado, mortal, difunto, vivo, leal, traidor, cobarde y animoso. No hallar fuera del bien centro de reposo, mostrarse alegre, triste, humilde, altivo. Enojado, valiente, fugitivo, satisfecho, ofendido, receloso. Huir el rostro al claro desengaño, beber veneno por licor suave, olvidar el provecho, amar el daño. Creer que en un cielo un infierno cabe, dar la vida y el alma en un desengaño. Esto es amor. Quien lo probó, lo sabe. So it's something that is very interesting. So I often kind of work with imagery, thinking about what it is that I want to do. I keep a journal. I don't title anything as I work through it. And then once the work is done, I go back to my writing and try to find titles. Try to think about what it is that I was thinking about when I was producing that. If I try to do both at the same time, it's very hard for me to keep the written word and the visual elements. Like I said before, I do rely a lot on written words, even for myself or poetry in this case. But this is another piece that is actually up in the gallery right now, and it's this sequence, this narrative. And again, even though there's no religious iconography in this, it kind of very inspiring the altarpieces, the idea of this sequential. You think of the predella, the bottom of the Renaissance paintings, that it kind of tells a little bit more of the story. It kind of influences this non-sequitur elements, non-sequential narrative, things that are important of the saint, of the main characters that you're talking about, is something like this. In this case, I'm not photographing film, I'm photographing digitally, but I am doing transparency and then a transfer. This is where you get all this texture. So the physicality of the print is very important to me, even when I work digitally. This kind of sequential narrative, kind of vague. You kind of get a sense of struggle and conflict, but I'm making you part of it. You are standing right on top of that backdrop. So you as the audience somehow might feel very uncomfortable because I'm putting you in that very uncomfortable place. I'm putting you in the artwork. Even if you're not physically there, even if your likeness is not in the images, you are there witnessing this and somehow giving you responsibility to do something and not do something. This is an image that came about when I was in Bulgaria about 2 years ago. I had the opportunity to go and do a residency there. And just like any other language, I tried to learn as much as I possibly can. This was the very first time that I traveled to a country that I did not speak the language. And that for me was very important because I never experienced that before. I always travel either in the States or places where I can get by with Romance languages. It's Italian, a little bit of French, Spanish. But this was the very first time that I did not speak anything. Now, I learned how to say good morning, good afternoon, how you doing? So when I would do that, people would assume that I spoke Bulgarian because nobody else was doing it. And they will continue talking to me. It's like, I'm sorry, this is all I know. You know, I'm going to have to use the translator at this point. But they were very, very nice to me. But one thing that happened there is that my brain somehow recognized that I was in a foreign place, and my very, very poor Portuguese and French will come up. It's like, this is not helping me in Bulgaria. This is just doesn't make any sense. Yet my brain recognizes the fact that you're in a foreign place, and you try to reach out whatever you can get. So for me is this idea of a dialogue with somebody, that you recognize what it is that you're saying or what the other person is saying, yet there's no communication. There's this misconnection. And the way I can represent it is through language. But really, it could be that both people are speaking the same language, but there's no communication. It's this idea of getting lost, this idea of not getting past something, not being able to move forward. But not only that, but the idea of that perhaps we both think we are moving past something, but it's really not happening because we think that we understand each other, but it's not. Something that you will see often, especially in the new work, is this idea of the house. The form, the idea of home. And in this case, these blurred images, limbless bodies, is this a river? Is this amniotic fluid? Is it the womb? It kind of referencing is very, very ambiguous. And I like to do that in the artwork. I like to kind of create these environments and these ideas or histories, but not tell you all the story, all the whole story, because I really want the audience to feel it and to identify somewhat with the work. This is another one that is very much about the work that I do, and this is something that Cheryl will notice, and probably hopefully you have this idea of a circle. Again, it's not an actual circle, but it's a circular composition. And if you see the actual image in the gallery, it creates, there's lines going this way and going that way, that it creates another house form on top of it. And this image also has 5 different geographical locations. And that, I'm telling you this because I get to tell you this, but it's really not important. It's about the idea of a landscape belonging together. In this case, I put it in a way that even though I'm actually putting upside down mountains, it kind of makes sense somehow. It is this idea of integrating all the experiences, the integrated past lives, integrating things that had happened before. This is the new work that I was talking about the house forms. And now I'm just going to give you a couple images so you have a sense of where I'm going with this. Remember I told you about prints? This is one of them. It's places you left, places that at some point felt like home, at some points were important in my life, but I no longer live there. So what I did is I actually photographed a bunch of images, and before, this is silver gelatin, which is paper. Before it dries, I start folding it into house forms. So technically, these are sculptures. They're very tiny thin, very, very small depth, but still, it's an object. It's no longer a print. And I'm doing a lot of different kind of mixed media. And in this case, actually upside down. The background image is only the beginning of the image. I'm very much interested in creating or making images versus taking images. I'm not just a kind of photographer that just goes around and photographs. I'm very interested about creating these environments and make this image happen. It didn't exist before I took it, I made it happen. Another one that shows the mixed media element, I'm really interested in the layering, because layering for me is very meaningful, about understanding, about meaning, about history. In this case, I'm combining 2 completely different mediums in one single image. Because you were very, very gracious and look at my work, I'm going to show you 2 images that I wish I would have done. And I'm actually borrowing this from a very good photographer, Keith Carter, that I think to this day is the best lecture I ever seen. So he ended up his lecture showing images that he wished he would have done. So I'm gonna do the same thing. The first one is this one that is actually kind of very geographically important. It's Stein, who was working out in Mexico. This whole series is it was shot in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And actually this Santa Fe Museum has one of the images there. And when I walked into the museum, I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. I remember reading about it. It was part of my dissertation in grad school, but I never actually seen one in person. And I was lucky enough to actually be seeing one. Not this one in particular, but Ronaldo's Doubt, I think it's called, the one that's in Santa Fe. Mm. The other one is Luis Gonzalez Parma. This is Guatemalan artist that I've followed through his career. I got to know him in grad school as well, with his first kind of big exhibition. And what I like about this is, again, like the physical layers of images. His overlapping negatives in this case with a hand-printed, hand-applied emotion photograph. But then you can see also the text. He's another person that uses a lot of text and a lot of narrative in his work. And that's something that I very, very admire. And then lastly, Serena Shah, a Iranian American who, again, became very famous and well-known in the early 90s. And actually, she spent a lot of time in Mexico. It has a couple projects that she did in Mexico. But she references religion, she references holy books, she references the cultural aspects of her culture. And like her, I feel the same way. She left Iran before the revolution when she was about 17 years old. So she has this kind of shorthand knowledge of the culture, of the language, but she lived in the States for so long that she also has this almost an outsider perspective. She thinks or understands things differently because she has that capability of moving back and forth between languages, between cultures, between ways of thinking. And that's somebody that I really kind of look back and I really enjoy her work. And that's all I have for you. Thanks for coming.